Every day, in this place and every place, I might live and breathe the gospel of Jesus Christ. Amen. Good morning again, everyone. Thank you all again for joining us today. It is on the second Sunday of our series on the gospel in popular culture. Last week, we had an enjoyable discussion about the gospel in folk music. We talked about the varying genres and the functions of folk music, and we focused specifically on three areas. We noted that folk music functions, one, as a means of cultural identity, two, as a means of spirituality and storytelling, and three, as a means of social change and societal critique. We enjoyed talking about works of musicians from Johnny Cash to John Denver, from Harry Chapin to Peter, Paul, and Mary, including a couple that were brought up to me this week that we missed, that we should have done. And we concluded with a performance of the Hammer song, which is up on our church website if you want to go back and enjoy that video again. And now, as a reminder, we're going to share with you our schedule for the next few weeks. And I'll ask Tim to bring up our PowerPoint again. This week, we're looking at the gospel in literature. And we have a few different genres, as with folk music, that we're going to focus on before going down to one of my personal favorites at the end. Next week, we'll go a little more narrow and we'll focus on fantasy. We'll take a break on August 5th before returning on the 12th with a discussion of the gospel in sci-fi. After that, we will look at gospel in Hollywood. We'll focus on some beloved Hollywood classics that we all know very well. We have one Sunday reserved for the gospel in comics. We're going to focus mostly on one very meaningful comic book character. And finally, we will have a discussion of the gospel in musicals, and we'll probably enjoy a few show tunes while we're at it. And again, we want to start with our first movie night this coming Friday at 6 p.m. right in here. I didn't mention that it can get a little stiff sitting in the pews for a long time watching a movie in here. So if you're able to come and planning to come, feel free to bring like a blanket or a pillow or whatever you need to make yourself comfortable. We want this to be a relaxing and enjoyable thing for the church to do together on Friday night. So again, Friday at 6 p.m. for the first one. But for today, we're keeping the movies and show tunes and comics out of it, and we're focusing on the medium of literature and looking at a few different genres. Specifically, we're going to look at three popular genres of literature before ending, again, with something more specific. So those three themes are going to be, first, satire. Second, adventure and romance, which really could be separate, but we're putting them together today. And third, tragedy, which is a surprisingly common literary genre. Now, the focus of satire is similar to that of the protest songs that we discussed last week in our talk about folk music. It is to hold up a mirror to society, specifically the society in which the satire operates, and to try to change it for the better. Works of romance and adventure, meanwhile, are going to deal with issues of classism and dynamics of power without overtly critiquing them like the satire does. And finally, the works of tragedy are usually going to deal with tragic or misshapen or misguided figures, characters in need of healing and who in many cases don't actually get that healing. So we have critiques of society, issues of power and economic class, and portrayals of tragic figures. All of these are present in the gospel of Christ. So we'll start with satire. We have a few examples up here. And not all of these are going to fit perfectly into these genres. As with our Lenten series earlier this year, there is some overlap. You could argue that some of these belong partially in other genres, but we have what we have. So, talking about satire in literature, there are a few that come to mind, just like we had specific artists last week who came to mind. And the purpose, as we've said, is to reveal the truth about society. And in the case of satire, it's often more of the ugly truth that no one wants to recognize. But the gospel literally means the good news. The good news. It is understood as the truth that we have all been perhaps blind to or naive toward. So you have humorists like Oscar Wilde revealing truth in The Picture of Dorian Gray, the truth that we all have this issue of aging that we have to deal with, this fear that we have to confront. And it does it in a slightly darker way through the risks of duplicitous living. Dorian Gray, of course, is the one where the portrait ages rather than the man, right? So the man is free to keep his beauty. For someone like Mark Twain, the gospel truth that he's trying to reveal through satire would be the ugly scar of racism in America. For someone like the French humorists here, Voltaire or Molière, or even for Jonathan Swift, these are all considered contributors to the Enlightenment age. That gospel truth for them would be perhaps a belief in freedom of speech, a belief in freedom of religion, and what was perceived at the time as a harsh critique of the Roman Catholic Church. And so part of the function of literature has been to use humor to critique the world, and in some cases the church itself. But beyond satire, gospel literature includes genres that are commonly understood and enjoyed, genres like adventure and romance. So we're going to move into that, and many of the most beloved authors of all time specialized in these genres, and we have our examples of this up here. We've got writers like Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Alexandre Dumas. They specialized in sweeping tales of drama and romance. Dumas had a lot of adventure as well. These are novels that explored the power structures of the time and the class dynamics of the societies in which they were written. Now, Christ himself did this in all of his sermons. He was a figure who was always aware of his audience, of his context, of the power dynamics around him, and he sought to transcend those dynamics and transcend the classism around him by offering his message to all, while also critiquing those in positions of power. Now, writers like these ones, they didn't overtly critique power structures in the way Christ did, or certainly in the way that some of those satirists did. But they drew from those power structures to tell compelling stories and explore the class dynamics of those societies. And we also have a few examples from the adventure genre. Adventure writers like Kipling or Jules Verne or J.M. Barrie, they explored more of humanity's relationship with nature, humanity's relationship with time, and with creation around them. So that's a little bit different and a little more spiritually focused. It raises issues of our relationship with creation, our relationship with the environment, and with our divine creator. So that's the second group that we're looking at. The third group, and one that I feel is very, very full of gospel truth, is the group of tragedy, the genre of tragedy, or in some cases, horror. This is, and this might be surprising, but maybe it's not. I don't know. This is probably actually the most common literary genre. Tragedy, as we know, it originated all the way back in ancient Greece, and it was among the staples of European writers like Shakespeare and Chekhov and Tolstoy. Now, as we said, a lot of these have some overlap. Chekhov and Tolstoy especially, and Shakespeare too, they all did a lot of romance and some comedy as well. But and this tragedy is present in writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Steinbeck. So we have it all over the place. But the real area of tragedy that we're going to talk about as a study in the gospel is maybe a bit of a surprise, and that's an area of horror, or perhaps of monster literature. And the reason we're doing that, and you see some examples of this up here, It includes works like Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, and even some older ones like The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Now, the reason we're doing this is because literature is full of tragic figures. The Great Gatsby, or even Don Quixote. But in the case of these misshapen or monstrous characters, the portrayal offered is, for the first time in history, one of empathy and compassion, often through misunderstanding of the characters within the story. Now, many of these deformed characters meet tragic ends, and their stories are tragic ones, but they are finally and ultimately portrayed as sympathetic rather than monstrous. And all this is in line with the gospel necessity that is preached to us over and over by Christ, which is to reach out to the other, to the leper, to the diseased, and to offer a presence of compassion and healing. So much of the time, as we've said, these stories, these sweeping novels reveal so much about the world. They reveal so much about the monster within us and how it is up to us to find that place of compassion, to build bridges to those who are different. So those are the three major areas, the sort of major genres that we wanted to do. That was more of an overview. And they are full of gospel truths. Satire as a means of critiquing society, romance and adventure, which explores classism and power structures, and tragedy and horror, which deals with broken, deformed, or misshapen characters, and which offers the reader, the audience, a chance to empathize with them. But I want to take the last couple of minutes here and focus on one literary work that is one of my personal favorites, and it belongs to a separate genre, which is that of the detective. And I've always been a big fan of Sherlock Holmes as a character and as a series. Now, Sherlock Holmes, as we all know, he is the world's greatest detective. Some people say it's Batman, but they're wrong. Batman's based on Sherlock Holmes. Holmes came first, so he gets that credit. Holmes has the ability to pick up on the smallest details, to put them all together, to deduce, to reach grand conclusions based on the evidence in front of him. He is a gifted scientist and a worshiper of reason and critical thinking. Now, all of this, it might make one think that Sherlock Holmes is a natural critique of religious thinking or a natural foil to religion because of his scientific ways. But the truth is precisely the opposite. Holmes is a character who needs to have everything explained by evidence in front of him, and that is a need that highlights one of the greatest spiritual struggles that we have as humans. And that is the ability to live within and cope with mystery. At the heart of every religion is the desire to solve a great mystery, the mystery of our own existence, the nature of creation. And so Sherlock Holmes is like all of us. He's trying to deduce the real truth from the world around him, from his observations of that world and from his sensory knowledge of it. And so at its core, the literature of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is literature of deriving truth out of mystery. Sherlock Holmes was, in fact, and some of you probably know this, he was based on a real person, a doctor, whom Arthur Conan Doyle knew in real life. That doctor's name was Joseph Bell. And Bell had the ability to look at his medical patients in the same way that Holmes would look at a crime scene or a mystery. And he would instantly deduce the problem by just observing small details about that person physically. And so from out of a great mystery and anxiety, this man could derive the truth simply by paying closer attention. So as we wrap up today, We're going to look at homes. We've looked at other genres and looked at how the gospel is alive in those as well. But we're going to look at homes. We're going to allow ourselves to pay closer attention to the world around us. And by which I mean not the noise that we are fed through news and media consumption, but rather the real gospel truth of the world around us. And that is the truth that we were all created by a loving God, one who saw fit to send down to earth his only Son, so that we might be redeemed through him and know eternal life with him. That is the great mystery that we have deduced. That is the great truth that men like Sherlock Holmes are seeking after. And it is not a truth that can be shrouded or covered. It can only be revealed through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God, and amen.